you very much. Thank you, Craig, and thank you, the Bay Area ACM chapter. I really appreciate being able to present here, and I really appreciate seeing familiar faces running into friends in the audience here. So it's good to be back here. So as far as data science reinvents learning, I'm going to pose that as a question because I do have a lot of questions there, but I do think that there are some very, very interesting things afoot, and we'll show some examples of that. And the subtitle, Beyond Gutenberg and Erasmus, we're really seeing a bit of an inflection point in terms of how do people consume media, particularly for learning. And when it comes to looking at books and videos and what the numbers look like from the publishers, it's getting very, very interesting. So we're going to try to address some of that right now. A little bit of background. I lead a new business unit called O'Reilly Learning. And we're responsible for all learning products, platforms, pedagogy across the company. This is relatively recent, only within the past 2 months. If we do our job right, you're not going to hear much about us. So it's something that we should be, as a company, part and parcel, a learning company. So hopefully we're working on the inside to make the outside look exactly like that. But I do think that the ACM is a great forum for this kind of discussion, this kind of dialogue, especially these types of technologies that came out of computer science and now are helping in a wide variety of different fields. A little bit of background on me before that. I was previously Director of Community Evangelism at Databricks, and glad to see Joseph Bradley coming up for the data science camp. I led evangelism and training, building that out for Apache Spark, and prior to that, I had led different data teams for several years. Some of them had some notable points. We had one of the largest instances of Hadoop in AWS in 2008, and I hired a consultant to help fix some of the pull requests on Hadoop at the time so that it could run on EC2. His name was Tom White, and he ended up doing some talks and eventually writing a book about some of his experiences back then. It's Hadoop in practice. And prior to that, actually, with some of the same team, we'd been one of the first 100% AWS system architectures right when AWS went public. So I've got a lot of background doing large-scale machine learning, with big data, on cloud, and a lot of this is coming into practice here in what we're doing at O'Reilly. Okay, so I'm going to throw out a slide here, maybe a little bit flippant, but what would Silicon Valley do? If we're going to approach learning, one of the common catchphrases around Silicon Valley, and I used to live in Mountain View right behind Google, one of the catchphrases that just terrifies me is, it's like Uber for ... And by the way, I'm an equity partner at a VC firm, Amplify Partners, so I do hear these kind of pitches occasionally. That leads to a question. What if there were something like, I don't know, Uber for education? What if you got that pitch? What would it look like? On the one hand, we might actually regret seeing what it turned out to be, something like this. On the other hand, do we really need an Uber for education? I have kids in public school right now, so I know that education is having a lot of difficulties in California, very definitely. And in general, we're seeing interesting changes. I also think that maybe Uber wouldn't quite take that approach. So let's pose it more as maybe Uber for learning would be something more apt. But in general, what we're looking at is what comes after books, what comes after Kindle, what comes after MOOCs. All of these are problematic. I love books. I love handmade books. I owned a bookstore for 7 years. And that was during the whole time, the rise of Amazon. I think the books are wonderful, but we're seeing a very different kind of consumption pattern. People, when they want to go learn something, don't necessarily turn to a book as much anymore. Kindle is very useful, but I also see problems with trying to move forward on these types of EPUB and MOBI formats for what we need to do. In particular, they don't work very well for executable content. And so that's a lot of what we'll be talking about tonight. And thirdly, MOOCs have become popular over the past 7 years, approximately. They've really taken off. So they're a relatively recent thing. But we are at a point where the people who created MOOCs, who've done really large-scale ones, are retrospecting. They're looking back at it and they're saying, okay, we've had some problems. How can we move forward doing something better? So I want to try to surface some of that, especially pointing toward the people who are doing really interesting work and what their learnings have been, some of the papers that they've been publishing, and also some of the systems that you can go and download and try. Now I'm going to nitpick a little bit. Sometimes when people say learning, then the next word that pops into your head is education. Next word that pops in is school. And I definitely want to qualify, we're not that. Schools are great, and I'm a big proponent. I went to school just a little bit west of Palo Alto, and I'm a big fan of some of the schools around here. So if you need a school, definitely pick one. But that's not what we're trying to be. We're going after a very different kind of market. I think one of the problems is that over the past couple of years, I've gotten to go out and do a lot of guest lectures around the world at some pretty big schools, and the dialogue that people are having is what's going to happen. And there are entire conferences dedicated to this, that even the best schools are looking at this near-term time frame. In their mind, 5 years is very near term. How are things going to change? I don't know if you've seen, but it's years ago, MIT made the decision to put their class content public, because that's not actually the proprietary part. The network that you build up and really what you learn by being in the midst of that social context, that's what MIT or Harvard or Stanford is really selling. The content, that can be used elsewhere. Now, the schools that aren't in the top tier are also probably questioning what's going on and how is this going to change. And I think that with MOOCs, it's become very interesting because I've seen instances where you'll have producer-consumer relationships. So for instance, there are restrictions on the UC system in terms of what types of MOOCs you can do. There are restrictions in the Cal State system, what types of MOOCs you can do. If you target a particular topic or a particular audience, then the boards will allow particular types of work. On the other side, there are schools that are very eager to consume content. Like for instance, UT Austin has 50,000 students, and they have a requirement from their state legislature to graduate a certain number of dentists every year. And they have amazing funding and huge endowment based off of property that was donated that had oil. So they have this great endowment for building buildings, but for actually hiring professors, not so much. So what they end up doing is actually bringing in content via MOOCs from other universities. And so because of the strange restrictions that you'll see in this landscape across the US and really across the world, there's a very interesting consumer-producer relationship there. The other thing is I'm going to nitpick here. I see a lot of this type of idea where education is focused totally in terms of let's go collect test scores, let's define a quantified student based on what we defined for our VC pitch, and let's just basically reuse some marketing funnel, use some ad tech, and go out and pitch this as some kind of platform. And I've seen a lot of that, and I'm going to nitpick. I don't mean to offend anybody, but when it comes to learning management systems, that's not what we're doing. We're going to avoid this as much as possible. We're really looking at something quite different. So in terms of definitions, definitely K through 12 is extremely important. That's not where I'm going to focus on. We have a little bit of work there where we do some effectively helping to sponsor, for instance, Safari for Schools, where K through 12 can get free textbooks if they want, technical textbooks. As far as undergraduate in universities, yeah, maybe textbooks or so, but it's not really the audience as much. Graduate probably gets more into conferences and all, but still not quite the audience. Most of what we see is professional. So we see people who are, number one, looking to make a change in terms of career, picking up a whole new different skill set, going for programming jobs, for instance, going for design jobs. And so that's more of a vocational category. We also see people who are active in their career, wanting to promote their skills and basically refine their tool set. So that's more aspirational, I guess I would call it. Maybe a better name would come in, but I can think of my own career as a data scientist. I want to try to be picking up as much as I can and learning from others who are in that field. So that's definitely a big segment that we see. Not just data science, but people like that, making a career path improvement. The third one, though, is very big. It has to do with proficiency. And this is where people have a specific thing they need to resolve. And they probably needed to resolve it like last week. So they're coming to try to find out, how do I fix this thing? My company just converted to Chef. And 2 of the people on my team know it, but none of the rest of us do. So let's go find out. Or my company was doing relational database, now we're doing Cassandra. And so now we need to cut over. Actually, we hear that a lot. So that's more proficiency. But then there's also familiarity. And I think that this is an interesting point where some of the more current research has been telling us something new. We hear a lot of people who might be, say, in product management, who want to go and learn to do more coding so that they can have more of a dialogue with their software engineers. That's a typical kind of case. And so that's more about familiarity. You're not trying to solve any specific problem, but you want to be able to get comfortable with the dialogue. And that leads to a category now that's starting to be called conversational programmer. I've got a link there from a paper from Philip Gu at Rochester, where he's really bringing out the point that when we look at education in computer science, it's mostly been focused on first-year computer science students. But we're not talking about first-year computer science students, so a lot of the research doesn't really apply when you go back and look through it. But conversational programmer is indeed the kind of thing that we definitely see. And I think that that holds true for meetups in general. Okay, so now I want to get to MOOCs. But let me ask, how many people have used any kind of online learning platforms? So almost every, let's say 80%. Okay, so almost everybody. How many people have used them as an instructor? Let's say about 5%. How about any names? Blackboard? I don't want to, okay, Blackboard. Moodle? edX? We're all raising our same hands on this. We've been through the range on that. There's a lot of interesting platforms. I want to try to surface some insights about MOOCs and where the MOOC community itself is looking toward the future and some of the better innovators. So MOOC stands for Massive Open Online Courses. And this started in 2008 out of Prince Edward Island. George Siemens and Stephen Downes were the first to do this. And if you actually want to check out the original MOOC, it's a slightly later version of it, but it's still online there. This is taken off, of course. edX is the big open platform that's a consortium of a number of universities. There's also Open edX. There are proprietary ones, Coursera, of course, Udacity, not too far away from here. Stanford Online is one example. Actually, I believe they're using Open edX. Udemy is actually one that's really taken off in Turkey, I believe. There's a number of these. I just wanted to put some up on the board to show that there's a range of different free or paid MOOCs that are out there. My own experience, I had led a team that was developing 2 MOOCs that became relatively popular. These launched in early June and late June, respectively. How many people took the Spark MOOCs? Okay, awesome. Good. Thumbs up? Thumbs down? Thumbs up? Okay, okay. Well, credit goes to... Yes?
So actually, I did both. And midway, I joined another group that we would meet together.
A study
group? Yes, like local groups.
Yes.
And I found the learning to actually grow and order higher because of just the fact that you talk to each other and each figures out the course slightly differently.
Oh, wonderful. I'm so glad you mentioned that. That's actually something we've been trying to understand. So let me repeat that. What we're seeing is that people, when they're working with MOOCs, we are seeing this kind of emergent thing where study groups will form. And so you had that experience. Was it with Spark the first one or the second one?
Second one.
So it was scalable machine learning.
I did by myself and I was feeling not lost, but I've got through. The second one, I could have also finished it by myself. But the learning I got by being with people made my learning probably 10x better in the sense understanding their experiences and things like that. Not like course content as such. That's what I'm saying.
Excellent. So to summarize then, say an order of magnitude more for proficiency or familiarity?
Familiarity, references, because they bring their job background and then you link your model with that.
So you're able to get the breadth out of the social context. Oh, this is excellent. We're seeing this, and actually O'Reilly is looking to sponsor some groups just because we think that we can find people who would lead them versus people who'd be interested, and I don't know, here's some books, here's some free books. We think that it's a good social context. And this is something that we've seen, is that when you get into the introductory courses, maybe not quite as much, but when you get into the more intermediate advanced courses, like the second MOOC here, had 4 case studies, effectively, in machine learning at scale. And when you see these more in-depth problems, these are ideally suited to group projects, study groups. And that social context is something that edX doesn't quite have, so people are doing it on their own. we had, I think, 80,000 people sign up between these two MOOCs, actually more than that. The first one was over 50,000. And all credit goes to the instructors, Anthony Joseph at Berkeley, Amit Talwalkar from UCLA, former people on my team, or I formerly led that team. And we had a lot of interesting times leading up to developing this content. So that's some of my background in MOOCs. But I want to summarize what I've been getting from my peers. Number one, it's very cost effective to use a MOOC to reach a large audience. And this was part and parcel of when they first started. 7 years ago, they were attempting to do remote learning, reach a very large audience. It's also very popular with students. We hear this talking to professors around the world. Undergraduates especially love to go after the MOOC content because they can do it on their own time, and you actually see it in the studies where the peak hours for some of edX is like between midnight and 2 a.m. It just makes sense. It reminds me of when I used to hang out in computer labs at Stanford. The pros. Another thing is that it addresses what I would call train the trainers. And in industry, in training for open source software, particularly in machine learning, some of the more complex packages in big data, distributed systems, the bottleneck that I see over and over across the Bay Area, across the world really, is train the trainers. It's easy to put together a company and get your funding and start to sell your package and your support. You get 1 or 2 trainers and it starts to take off. But when the big fish come in, the Ciscos of the world want to come in and they want an army of trainers, you can't hire those people. You can't hire them fast enough. So there's always this bottleneck that we hear of, train the trainers. And we are seeing MOOCs being used where instructors, actually high school instructors or college instructors, will go and take the MOOC and then present the same material to their students a day later. So it really is effective in terms of being able to help add new content, new skills for the instructors themselves. In terms of cons, though, this is what we saw, and this is what we've heard over and over. It's about 20 to 1 in terms of the amount of time you're going to spend recording the video. It's very expensive, and that's actually probably about 3x my own experience in terms of video studios at O'Reilly as an author building video content. Working with the edX platform is about 3x more expensive. And so it's kind of unwieldy. And curating, once you have created the content, curating that video is also difficult, which is something that needs to change. When we look at the figures for undergraduates and graduates, it's roughly 3/4 of them are sampling. They don't really intend to be studying this, they're just kind of perusing it. So you see these enormous rates of people coming in and signing up for the course, but again, at least 3/4 of them are sampling. It's not, well, it depends. If you're trying to say that you're putting all this effort, again, 20x in terms of recording the video, but you have a fairly low completion rate. I mean, to put it into advertising terms, what's your conversion rate? If you're gonna, okay, so if I was buying an ad campaign and I had a very, very low conversion rate and I blast out banners everywhere, what's the point? So if I'm an instructor and I want to teach a course of 50 students, great. And if I go to all this extra work to do this broadcast thing, but then at the end result I get some small multiple of that, what's the investment there? Why should I be doing that?
But you should be comparing to those 50 people that you were able to train before that.
What?
You are not supposed to compare like how many your conversion ratio. You're supposed to compare, okay, last year I was able only to reach 50 people, now I can do 5,000.
Yeah, but what we're seeing is not that. We'll keep it rolling, but the numbers, I need to, well, for one thing, the completion rates are single digit, is what we see. We see some that are actually very successful that are 10% completion rate. So yeah, you might broadcast out to 5,000, but then even if you're lucky, only 500 are completing. Okay, if you're not lucky, much less than that, which means that you probably wasted a lot of time. That's the end result of this. And if it's difficult to curate, then that means you've got this content out there that you're not going to update. So are you going to go and redo this again next year? Probably not. So that's why I say it's upside down the equation. Yes?
Question, would it make sense for some types of students, like the ones that are just getting skills, just to break it up into like 5-10 minute segments and then have a diagram, proceed on this path if you want X and that path if you want Y?
Yeah, and so there are actually studies. So the question was, can we break it up into smaller increments and get much more flexibility this way, or much more coverage this way? And there are studies that are showing that the optimal video length is on the order of like 5 minutes, 5 to 6 minutes. So that does make sense. It's also somewhat of a chaotic experience. If I'm leading a class, and I have over the past year been leading full-day workshops that had up to 450 people. And being an instructor in front of hundreds of people for 8 hours is an interesting experience, but it's also very fun. You have to work to try to keep it from devolving into a lot of chaos. When you have 50,000 people out in the audience, game over. You can't even assume that once the content is out, students start doing what they want to with it.
So what I felt was, if some way that we could convey what our prior experience is, number theory, this and stuff like that, you take that as an input and then you create a roadmap of these lectures, these small 5 or 10 minute lectures, and you build a personal.
Let me move toward. I like where you're going there, but let me show some professors who are doing that. Yeah. So we'll flip. I'm trying to do a little contrast first, but we'll show flipped classrooms basically. Another thing is a lot of people. Yes. Question back.
Before you leave the slide, could I add one more cons?
Sure.
This is based on like 10 going on 10 months of experience of a series in data science, for instance. Let's call it just abysmal pedagogic technique.
Yeah.
Okay. And maybe looking at that a little bit. There's no review. The assessment is of the student, not of the course and the instructors.
I will get there. I drink that Kool-Aid completely. Okay, so let me. Okay, so the thing was that the pedagogy is just abysmal. I mean, the teaching techniques are all over the map, and there's not a lot of curation or editorial there. So that's one thing about crowdsourcing is you're not going to have a lot of strong editorial input, or coaching even. But let me get to the point here. The last line about the elites. There was a study came out in Nature recently, and what it showed was that 80% of the people who were taking MOOCs already had an advanced degree in that field. And also 80% come from the richest 6% of the population. So, the idea that we're going to put all this effort into doing MOOCs and it's these big government projects that are going to democratize education, that's complete BS. Okay, the numbers show it completely the opposite. So I think there's something to be learned there, and I think the numbers will speak themselves, but we should apply some science toward how we're doing this. Michael Shanks said this at the Future Learning Conference in May at Stanford, was that what he's seeing is that really there's this kind of pushback in the major universities, a sort of retrenchment of the major disciplines to even make the disparity more pronounced. So the cheaper that you make these ubiquitous sources for learning, the more that the big players in education are going to up the ante and make it even more valuable to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to get their degree. And that is some of the operative thinking right now. There's good and bad here off of Jeffrey Fowler's Wall Street Journal article, actually a couple of years ago, but early report card on MOOCs. And I'll definitely leave that there. I've summarized some of the points in earlier bullets. But the thing is that edX is kind of the 800-pound gorilla as far as the open platform, and already some universities have rejected it flat out. Amherst, Duke, and others are saying, no, we don't want to do this. Caltech also, I think, had a much better way of handling this. They tried to adopt edX to pull their pedagogy into it, and they backed off and said, no, we're not going to do that. So edX is getting a little bit of backlash. There's a great conference a friend of mine is hosting at GWU. It's the Open edX University Symposium in November. So to summarize, search engines really surface a lot of choices about available learning content. If I want to go out and learn how to do annotations in Java, which is something that I've always there's always weird stuff coming up in Java about annotations. So for me, that's why something, I don't know why, it's like this learning block. If I go out and search for it, I can find all kinds of things on Stack Overflow, but I have to weed through to figure out what I actually believe. The other thing is that given a flood of different types of material, what the people who lead MOOCs are seeing is that you really want to have that social context to get people to want to go through the material. Again, getting back to the study groups or something more social as a driver. And to Michael Shank's point, when you look at academia, when we talk about doing computer science or civil engineering or physics or any of these major disciplines, the approach in academia is to decontextualize. If you go through mechanical engineering, you will study years' worth of thermodynamics, much more so than you will go and study how to build little widgets. And the point is that when you get done with that program, you have a general background that can be applied throughout and extend throughout your career over many years. That's decontextualizing the problem. But in a lot of these kinds of things that people want to learn online, it's much more interdisciplinary, it's much more contextualized in your job, what you need to solve. So there's a tension between academia and what's going on with the online learning. There's also the problem of how do we even recognize if learning has happened? If I have a class of 30 people, I can start asking some questions, and we can do some group projects, I can do some evaluation. If I have 300 people, there's no way. If I have 30,000 people, it's inconceivable that I can really get a good signal, other than just throwing out some tests and seeing how people score. And I don't know that I necessarily believe those. So, examples. I did enough bashing on MOOCs. Let me talk about some great examples here. Peter Cork in Australia, QET, did this one, Intro to Robotics. And it was interesting because he pointed it at teams in sub-Saharan Africa and India. And a lot of these teams couldn't even afford the basic electronics kits. They had to do like Kickstarters just to be able to come up with small amounts of money to fund their project. But then when they got it, they really poured their souls into it. And what he did, the interesting thing, was to apply a lot of peer review so that the teams would have goal-directed outcomes and be able to measure each other's success and give each other feedback. And by this way, he was able to get some very good social context at scale. And we are seeing this. I have friends in Scandinavia who do a lot of work with MOOCs, and Scandinavia being a bit more neutral than the US, they tend to get engineering contracts in Africa and other places more so than US firms. And they do see that their content really hits more, again, in Africa and India, Brazil, et cetera. Another one that I think is really interesting was Michael Starbird at UT Austin. And a friend of mine was one of the instructors on this, Donna Kidwell. And what they found was it wasn't as interesting to look at the test results of the students. It was more an interesting thing to watch where the students were basically able to get unblocked. Where were the students able to have an epiphany moment to start to understand complicated material? Because if they could take those points and feed them back to the other students, they could really accelerate the process. And so learning to get social cues about where these epiphany moments are, it's difficult, but it is possible in some social context. We're seeing other teams that are going after that specifically. Another one that I'd point to is Yasser Abu Mustafa at Caltech has been doing this for a while. They have a machine learning course at Caltech, which is a very good example of what's called the flipped classroom or inverted classroom. And the idea is this. Rather than putting together a 20-to-1 ratio of filming all these videos and putting together tests and doing all this program and then launching it out to the world, instead, they're going to take a look and say, why don't we get some material out there, let people work with it, and then measure how they're doing, get their feedback, get the pros and cons back from them, and use that to guide the next lecture. So it's all... Pardon?
Agile education.
It is very much like a software engineering approach, yes. So it's being called flipped classroom or inverted classroom. And the idea is really how can you steer the instructor towards a minimum viable product for the next lecture. And this scales. It has much more of a social context to it. It's much more suited to the level of the students, assuming that you can segment. And of course, they're not all going to be the same level, but yeah.
If you have 1,000 or 5,000 students, how do they do the inversion? How do they assess it?
Excellent question. So repeat the question. If you have 5,000 students or some large number, how do you do this kind of assessment? How do you get that feedback to the instructor? And for that, it's still a greenfield. We're learning. We're starting to use some of these techniques at O'Reilly, and I can talk about them. But I would point to this as probably one of the best examples. I was just over in Stockholm, met with some of these folks. David Black-Schaefer was at Stanford. He's now at Uppsala. And Sverker Jansen, I was working out of the 6 lab. Sverker is at 6, which is out of Stockholm. And they have a project called Scalable Learning. Actually, as you go through the videos, the students will stop at different points, and the actual diagrams in the videos have hotspots, which actually have the coding projects, have the quizzes, so it's all in context. And they have the chat, the dialogue with other students right there. And they're using some NLP to find out, really to summarize to the instructor, where are the problem spots? Where is it that people are not able to get past the video, or maybe having to scrub back, or not able to complete the coding exercise? That's a pain point, and that's what the instructor needs to know. And if you can surface that at aggregate, then you can start to address some larger numbers.
The data science approach, effectively?
Well, this is where we're taking some, we are taking some or we, royal we, but in the industry, you're seeing people taking a much more analytic view toward adjusting the instructor for the learners, as opposed to how can we make the teaching platform better, if that makes sense. I'll talk more about it. There's a better one even than this, but this is a good, there are some nice courses on this. A friend of mine, Saif Hariri, has been using this for machine learning and big data. If you want to look at this in general, I would recommend the Center for Teaching and Learning at UT Austin. They've really pioneered a lot of this. They have a nice tutorial about how to flip your classroom if you are an instructor. Talking about some of these principles. I've summarized them here, but they have a more extended tutorial that's linked there. And more to the point, I think even going beyond MOOCs, I would point toward Philip Guo at Rochester. How many people here have ever used Python Tutor? Okay, good. Thumbs up? Anybody? Thumbs up? Más o menos? Okay, so a mix of results there. How about Coachella? Have you seen that? Coachella is one of these more where you're taking a look at a large group of people and how are they doing on coding exercises. Python Tutor is, I'm showing it down here, but you start to do programming exercises and you can see the data structures being visualized as you're programming. And it works in a variety. It works with Scala, it works with Java, it works with a lot of different types of programming languages. But Phil's been doing work on this type of interactive, collaborative learning, particularly with respect to getting back to your question here about 5,000 people, because he runs about a 50-to-1 ratio of TAs. So now if you had 10 TAs, then you could go with a class of 500. And I think that's actually pretty reasonable. I'm not sure that I don't drink the Kool-Aid necessarily on having a 50,000 student MOOC. I don't really see the point. I helped on one of those, and I don't think I will do that again. But a class of 500, I think, is pretty reasonable. Is that kind of? So that's what he's going toward, is how can you really empower the TAs, the mentors, and put some numbers behind it. Overall, if you have one takeaway from this, I recommend Lorena Barba. She teaches in engineering at George Washington, and there's a video, also her slides from her keynote address. We were up at Microsoft for PyData a few weekends ago, and she took on the whole area of data-driven education and quantified student, and you have to watch this video. In some ways, she slaughters the whole notion of quantified student because there's so much badness out there, and she has some numbers to show actually just how much of train wrecks some of those were. But also some very good approaches too that are using the numbers. So that's a bit about MOOCs. I think that the takeaway there is that flipped classrooms, inverted classrooms, are very interesting. And for online training at scale, including some social interaction, including some dialogue with the instructor is very important. I don't want to get into just a broadcast mode. So at O'Reilly, we do a range. I'll talk about that. But I'm very interested in pursuing this inverted classroom. Project Jupyter. How many folks have worked with IPython Notebook or Project Jupyter? Okay, let's say at least half. So if you haven't seen it, jupyter.org. I highly recommend. It started out of IPython. It was IPython Notebooks, but it's evolved now. There are 50 different language kernels, actually more than 50. So there's a range of different things you can run on the back end. And there's a lot of open source notebooks flying around the internet. GitHub has it such that if you check in a notebook, they'll actually render it and show it there, just like they would do with Markdown. So these are really catching on. They got some new funding in July. Fernando Perez created this. Fernando was trying to be here tonight. He's at Berkeley, Lawrence Berkeley, and he had some things come up at the last minute. But he jokes that he needed to finish his PhD, and so in order to waste time and not finish his PhD, he created IPython Notebook. And now, years later, it's become quite popular. Jess Hamrick is a PhD student at Berkeley who's been doing auto-grading, some interesting test evaluation modules built into Jupyter. And there's also a lot of new work. The new funding is actually tied to more of the social aspects, doing multi-user servers. I've got a lot of lists here. I'm not going to go through these too much. I'll go through a few. But definitely check out the PDF for this and check out some of these links if you want to study more about Jupyter. We're surfacing a lot of this, and I'll show you how O'Reilly's using it. There'll be a lot of examples there. I will show a bit more about Jess Hamrick's work. She's working with Rackspace and deploying architectures for being able to have some arbitrary number of notebooks running in a server environment. And this is really the problem with scale, is if we understand pedagogically how do we approach having 5,000 students or 500 students, that's good, but how about the learning resources? If they're actually all trying to work in a sandbox, doing some coding, you could hand out USB drives with VM, with like Vagrant and doing VMs, but that only goes so far. So notebooks are actually a way we can leverage containers for this and get much better scale. Also much more cost effective. This gets back to literate programming. Anybody read Literate Programming by Knuth? Definitely, one of my favorites. The idea is instead of imagining that our main task is to instruct a computer what to do, let us concentrate rather on explaining to human beings what we want a computer to do. And that is a lot of the idea that's going on with Jupyter, with these notebooks. Now, as far as examples, some of the best that I would point to are coming out of this organization called Code Neuro. And this is where some of the top neuroscientists in the world get together for a weekend twice a year, and they do a kind of a hackathon based on Spark and Jupyter. So they have these huge data sets coming off of microscopes, real-time telemetry of watching calcium activations in large networks of neurons. And they're using Spark streaming to be able to collect that and shape the data. But then they're using IPython Notebook, or Jupyter now, to share their research results. I mean, the way that this kind of research goes is some teams will be funded to collect the data, other teams will be funded to analyze it in various ways. This is very rich data. So effectively, this is a way of sharing the science across teams across the world. Jeremy Freeman is leading the Freeman Lab that created Code Neuro. If you look at notebooks.codeneuro, there's some great examples there. I'm actually not on the internet, so I'll have to do something about that. Matthew Conlin does a lot of the data viz. He created Lightning, which is one of the better visualization packages for Spark and others. Matt Conlin also is the data viz person for 538, if you follow politics and sports. Olga Bavatnik down at UCSD has done very nice work to put together a consistent pipeline for science, bioscience at UCSD based off of IPython Notebook. This same team working with Jupyter and then working with Code Neuro just came out with something a couple days ago. It's called My Binder. And the idea is if you have notebooks checked into a GitHub repo, you can basically add your URL for your repo into a binder, and then it will generate them, basically containerize them in Docker and run them on top of Kubernetes. So it's a way of basically saying, here's all the dependencies, here's what I want to run, let me just go out and scale it. So again, we're seeing that, especially in education, this getting the infrastructure out there, we believe that it's something that we can reuse the technology that we've seen out of Silicon Valley for scaling other areas. Yes?
What is Kubernetes?
Kubernetes is a veneer on top, well, it's from Google, but it's the idea of being able to take a lot of containers and run them in some systematic way. You might have effectively different bundles, different types of containers that work together. So if you have a Spark cluster, but then it consumes from a drill cluster and it's got some Redis, how can you define all these? You have some Docker images, but then you have to have something to go out and run them. And if you need to have N of these, then Kubernetes would be the way to scale up, auto-scale it. You can think of it as like a layer on top of Mesos, or it could be on top of OpenShift. Google runs on GCP, but it's a very convenient way of being able to manage the scale out. Question?
If you were to run this in a classroom environment and have multiple people sharing it and it be active, so that if the instructor is changing, they all are able to see it, is there a way to do that?
It depends. There is work on being able to do, so to repeat the question, if you're working with these documents, and I'll show some here, the notion is you have a document, it's in the browser. So the question is, if there's a change made to the document, does everyone see it? There is work towards that. There are some instances of that. Databricks does that. That's one of the key features. And so it's somewhat like using Google Spreadsheets, where you have a team of 20 data scientists that are all in the same document, running the same workflows, and they see the same results. I've had that experience where I had 3 teams remotely distributed working in the same notebook. I won't go into huge detail on that, but it was very effective. With the default with Jupyter is no, but it's evolving toward that. And those kind of features are very, very difficult, obviously. But that's a lot of the reason for the funding with Jupyter Hub is to build in more collaborative features. So as it stands, everybody gets their own sandbox, or every team would get their own sandbox. Okay, so I want to talk about how we're using this. So first off, there was an article here, Embracing Jupyter Notebooks at O'Reilly. And we have a content platform that authors use. It's called Atlas. And you can go in, you can import ASCII doc or Markdown or HTML5. You can write your books in some semi-structured way. And then basically, once you've got your whole book and your editors worked with you and commented and changed things, you can click a button and generate output. So you can imagine turning the dial toward an EPUB, you'll get an EPUB output, or toward Mobi, and you'll get Kindle, or toward PDF, you'll get PDF, or prepress. But the other thing we've added is Jupyter. So when you think about the books that we usually do on technology, if you've got some book about, let's say Spark, I worked on Spark a lot, you've got a book about doing PySpark, so you've got a chapter showing different code that you could execute in PySpark. The idea here is that when you're writing a chapter in a book, it looks like a sequence of Markdown and code and output and Markdown and code and output, which is exactly what Jupyter provides. So we basically mark the code segments as executable. Question?
You mentioned one word, sort of word that you hadn't before, editor.
Editor, yes.
Which in the learning situation didn't appear.
So the operative theory was that we get rid of the editors and we just crowdsource this whole thing and magically hundreds of millions of people will be, and that didn't work too well. And editing is expensive and difficult, and it's a profession. And it's something that we do really well at O'Reilly. It's one thing I really love about O'Reilly. I worked for other publishers, so I mean, just quite candidly, the experience here has been, I mean, I was an author up until two months ago. And the experience had been that working with O'Reilly, I would get one editor to talk with, and it would be a 6-month project, and boom, we're out the door. At other publishers, I might talk to 12 editors over a period of 2 years, and it's a mess. So we really take the editing seriously, but it's a hard problem. It's an extremely hard problem. And a lot of people would like to get rid of that problem. I don't believe it.
You made me think of something when you were talking about creating those chapters. If you could, so this is going to be online content, the PDF, whatever it happens to be, or you could have the book as an online content. So when they're creating these chapters of exercise and stuff that the students do, if that could be integrated with a Python notebook that the student could actually use.
Yeah, there you go. So, well, actually, Tim's saying things about it. That's good. So yeah, that's actually what we did. You're right on target. So what we did was we said, yeah, we can generate books, we can generate PDFs, but let's just actually generate IPython notebook. And instead of building chapters, let's build notebooks. And so a book now, in our thinking, is more of a matter of here's some video segments, here's some notebook segments, here's some social interaction. And by the way, it's running in Docker. We can scale it out. We can run 10,000 of these at a time for a given title. So here's a little bit of a preview of some of the work. Kyle Kelly runs ops for Jupyter. He's also at Rackspace. Rackspace has been sponsoring part of this. Andrew Ottawan is CTO of O'Reilly, and I've done a lot of pair programming with both of these gentlemen over the past few years, and very glad to be working with them now. There's a good, at a data science conference in Boston a few months ago, they gave this talk, and so I'll recommend it. Just my own background, I had done this book called Just Enough Math. Started out being a book, we went to video and then made notebooks and stopped doing the book. We realized that the content needed to be interactive and it wasn't going to be good as a published thing. So it's now exactly that, videos plus notebooks. We had some meltdowns when we tried to go run this at a conference in front of hundreds of people, and we learned a lot. We learned that Docker is really great at running the things inside of Docker, but the stuff outside of Docker, not so much. So when we fired up some big iron with hundreds of containers on it, the first thing we noticed that we had 3,000 open file handles, and that was a problem. Go ahead.
Compare notebook here versus like Mathematica notebook.
Well, that's great. I didn't do like a whole NASCAR slide, but Mathematica has been in this game for a while. They've been doing notebooks. We're working with the containerizing parts and also the media player part that I'll get to in a bit. So there's a few subtleties, but Mathematica has a lot of depth. But other people are commercializing this. I mean, we look at Quantopian and Sage Math Cloud and others who are doing this. Really good work. Yeah.
So with the Berkeley course, when I was going through the user groups, the best part I liked was everything was packaged into the VM. You download it, the environment doesn't matter. and I saw very few questions which are environment related that people put up.
So yeah, so especially, yeah, I know Amit had done a lot of work. So the question was that in the Berkeley course for Spark on edX, that they had used VMs, and they put a lot of effort towards packaging that. That worked really well. Although I've had the experience where I walked into a business audience with 100 people in the room and said, run Vagrant. And I found out that people had configured different versions of Vagrant, and the VMs weren't compatible. I mean, there are subtleties there you have to really watch out. If you tell everybody, wipe your laptop and install this, then it'll work. But in a lot of cases, that's problematic. It's also problematic, well, for other reasons, about network bandwidth and conferences and things like that. Anyway, when we did the work with Just Enough Math, we were guinea pigs. And a week or two later, what came out was Nature did an article where they took the article they were going to publish about IPython notebook. But the notion is the code, the data, the article, all wrapped up in a container. And then the same team, Kyle Kelly's team at Rackspace, ran this for Nature. And they had high water marks of about 10,000 viewers at a time. And I think this is stunning, because now we can take scientific papers, publish the code, publish the data. People can repeat some of the science. And we're using this cluster computing technology to provide it. And I think that's awesome. That is repeatable science. Yes?
And where is this hosted?
This was hosted by Rackspace. So O'Reilly and Nature and Rackspace were.
So in some of these situations where you wind up having, for example, Google talking about drug discovery, which winds up taking 40 years of computer time on 70,000 clusters.
That's a different kind of thing. That's not, I can't open that kind of science just yet. But some things we can get closer to. Atlas, if you want to check it, you'd have to have a login. But it's where we put together our content. It's backed by Git. So we do project collaboration through Git. Thebe is a layer that we put on top. Zach Schwartz did this. It's open source. It's on GitHub. And the idea is that notebooks, as you'll see, notebooks are basically this array of cells. Some of the cells are executable, some are marked down, and some are output. And you can bring it up in your browser, but it's not really HTML. So what we did was essentially a media player for notebooks, so that you could embed it as HTML on any web page, but then also have graceful degradation. So if somebody loses network, they can still see the results. They just won't recompute. Yeah.
Kind of return back to my prior question for just one quick second.
Okay.
A lot of
I
this,
can't answer for Google.
No, well, screw Google. Okay, it turns out we've got, let's look at deep learning or something like that, or a result on a lot of stuff that's being done nowadays, pretty much in any paper that you want to read. How the stuff goes on and gets part. It's not platform independent. You go on and have stuff that requires GPUs or requires other stuff. The idea, in essence, is just showing an algorithm without showing the architecture that it's hosted on. That is, I think we might be past those days, unless, of course, this is for an algorithms course where you're teaching quicksort or something.
Well, I mean, there's a whole range. I mean, when we look at learning, there is kind of this funnel notion, or rather this sort of power law curve. You get people on the front end who want to learn how to do Python and are struggling with it. And until they get somebody who can really knock down the examples.
So when you talk about professionals in all these prior slides, you're really talking about guys that have just gotten out of school and looking to go on and work. I'm sorry.
No, I'm seeing people who have graduate degrees, who have 5-10 years out in the field, and they may have worked with 5 different languages already, but they're learning their 6th. Or maybe they know the languages, but they're working with distributed systems now. So they know Python, they don't know PySpark. So how do you knock down those hurdles? Beta, if you want to check out what we're doing with this, beta is what we're running, and I'll have to get logged in. If you log into beta, go to learning, and under there, there's a few different ones. Jake Vanderplas at UW has some great notebooks. He was actually using in his courses at UW, and we're working with Jake. So just to kind of show it off to him, we actually imported the stuff off his GitHub, put it through Atlas, and then published it and showed him. So if you want to run it, he's got some great examples of machine learning, like if you want to see introduction to, it was a few different things here. I'm going to move ahead because I got to get to some points here. When we look at what people do for learning, I couldn't put it all on one slide, obviously. There's so many different tools out there. But I want to start talking about it. I think Slack is a really great tool for learning. I see this across companies, especially technology companies. Obviously, YouTube. I have an 11-year-old and a 10-year-old, 2 daughters, and they learn things. They learn how to create jar files on YouTube. Stack Overflow, edX, Pluralsight, SlideShare, Meetup. These are all learning tools. And it's not traditionally where we are as a book publisher, but we're learning that this is where we need to be. I wanted to try to rationalize this. I want to try, again, provide some phenomenology and come in with more of my background as a data scientist, trying to understand how do the parts fit together and how can we instrument it and do something formal with it. So what I'm projecting is this. What if we think about this in maybe a couple dimensions here? One being synchronous versus asynchronous. We do see a lot of people who want on demand. I can point to large companies who will tell you point blank, we're going to train our people all completely on demand because our people, our consultants, charge $2,000 an hour. We're not going to go put them in a classroom. So give us everything on demand. You also have, on the other side of the spectrum, people who want to go to conferences and have the hallway track and spend the time and be immersed and learn a lot of things serendipitously. And meetups are very much an important part of that as well. So I've got this spectrum of synchronous versus asynchronous, and the flipped classroom, the inverted classroom model, is really kind of squarely in the middle. It's drawing on both. I also have this dimension here of paywall versus free content, because when I look across the industry, there is a spectrum there. And understanding where the business models come in and where is it that people really want the paywall. We have Safari. We own this large back catalog, not just of O'Reilly books, but of a lot of different publishers. And a lot of enterprise, they sign up for this wholesale. So it's a really great kind of professional reference library. But it also includes interactive tutorials now. So from that, I will say there's a nice paper, speaking of which, behind a paywall from Deloitte. But it's about learning architecture. And this is a buzzword that's catching on. How do companies, how do teams think about not just having this ad-hoc view, but actually having something more structured? The other thing I'll put out there is that as a sidebar, where do we get the instructors? Where do we get the teachers, the writers, the speakers? There's been a notion for a long time that you go after the innovators. But I'm finding that, especially in open source, my experience in evangelizing open source projects here in the Bay Area, going after the innovators is problematic, and it doesn't really pay off. So I'll put this out here as a question. If you go back to Everett Rogers' innovator, adopter, majority, laggard, et cetera, I would say that early adopter into early majority is probably where you really find the experts. These are the people who fix the bugs that the innovators wrote in their code. These are the people who really deploy it for use cases. And I think that's a change in thinking. I think that we need to learn more from the people who have that hands-on experience, more so than the people who are just writing APIs. I would put this out there, that when you look at how publishers go after, and we're guilty of this, but when you look at how publishers go after authors, speakers, instructors, usually it's in fairly large increments. We tell you, sign a contract, some number of months, deliver the material. An editor will work with you, but it's going to be a large investment of time. In software, we don't do that. In software, we will define, let's focus it down just on what we need to implement. Let's leverage APIs, reuse libraries. Let's do small incremental changes towards goals and measure the outcomes. Let's get stuff out there, test it in customer experiments, and start seeing what features have traction. And I believe that actually taking learning products, bringing down that incremental, that impulse function of the cost into smaller increments is where we're trying to drive toward, especially with notebooks. So what that will require is moving beyond EPUB and Mobi. There's been a kind of dominance of EPUB and Mobi in the industry. And one thing that they do is to preclude use of a lot of interactive content. So I have been talking around about this, circulating this, that we need to come up with a new format where we can have video together with executable content, together with these other aspects that we're seeing showing up in, like, for instance, inverted classroom models. Again, something that's instrumented, something that we can experiment with, something that we can run analytics on, something we can iterate over. I'm not going to go through everything because I do have to catch a flight, unfortunately. So I've got a red eye out to Boston tonight. But part of the thinking is that rather than measuring student test scores, I'd like to measure how are people really working with executable content and where are their pain points coming into it. And to do that, we need to break it down into multiple dimensions. It's not just a matter of somebody buying a book, but it's a matter of where are they when they open the book? Are they utterly confused? Are they looking through a book that's really familiar territory? There's a spectrum there. But that's just one dimension, and I could point to at least a half dozen or more. And we need to understand these when we're trying to set up content with people who want to use the content. So I think there's a multidimensional problem here that will require data science techniques. This is the kind of thing I would throw a PCA or clustering at, definitely. And to that note, there's been interesting research. Anybody seen this from Julian Macaulay? Anybody seen the beer study? If not, I recommend it. It is some great work. Julian was a postdoc at Stanford recently. He's now off as a professor, but he was working in Yuri Leskovic's team, working on large-scale recommender systems, and they looked at time-based recommender systems. And Julian's from Australia, and when he got to the US, he detested the beer in the US. So he started doing some studies, and he found out there's a lot of data, a lot of open data. You know, there's Beer Advocate, and there's all these different like tasting score websites where you can get a lot of data about people and beer. And so he started feeding disparate sources together into recommender systems and testing, you know, the outcomes with what was already published. And what he found was there is actually kind of a time-based way of measuring as people encounter a community. Actually, the language that they use to interact with the community describes how far away they are from it. A distance metric in terms of recommender systems, if you will. And you can actually, what Yuri has gone, of course, Yuri does a lot of work for Facebook and others, but his lab has been looking at this and saying, you know, we can actually start to get a signal of when we think somebody's going to leave a group just by the language. Because the language of the group evolves over time and the language of the individual evolves over time. And when you start to see somebody coming in from a large distance and then bounce off, you can tell they're almost gone. So, you know, there's obvious marketing uses for that kind of thing, but there's also learning uses for that kind of thing. Especially when social context is so important. It's one of the great learnings that we've had out of MOOCs is they lacked the social context. So how can we apply a lot of NLP and other methods of what's being called discursive analytics to really measure how far away is somebody? Do they get it or not? Not just because they took a test, but how are they interacting with their peers based on this material? So closing it up then, going back to Uber for Learning, books aren't being used by learners as much, and experts don't have time to write books as much. So we have to get away from that. Speaking as a publisher, this is top of mind. If we can understand, using some interesting science, how do learners, how are they with respect to various communities that they're trying to learn from, and can we personalize what they need? Also help the lecturers understand personalizations, like we see in inverted models. And can we also go into new formats of being able to take this content, break it into smaller pieces, containerize it, find ways to reuse it? We have a very different landscape then, and it's one that's much more amenable to the kind of data science techniques that I was doing in ad networks or social networks. But again, from a learner perspective, not trying to force things on people, but actually seeing, are they getting it? If you're interested in this, let us know. And if you want to catch up with me, I've got a website up there. There's a lot of links here, and I can get on the Wi-Fi, but I probably should go to the airport. So I will leave the links for an exercise for the interested reader, so to speak. And I'm going to hang out for a little bit if there's any questions. Thank you very much. Question?
So when people say MOOCs don't work, and they typically point to the high dropout rates and stuff, which is surely a side effect of the fact that they get lots of issues. But surely the main metric in whether a MOOC works or not, whether it's accepted as interchangeable, found to be interchangeable by employers.
Well, yeah. I mean, does it? Yeah. So I mean, there are a lot of studies that. So the question was, what is it that we're measuring when people say that MOOCs don't work? And the single-digit completion rate is the thing that people point to. I think that the damning evidence is that 80% of the people taking them already have advanced degrees in that field, or they happen to be people who are fairly wealthy, and they're not exactly struggling to learn this material. That's the bulk of the people who are actually taking MOOCs.
I mean, isn't that just a customer acquisition thing? I mean, if you deliberately target meetup groups in developing countries, you could totally skew the enrollment.
I'll give you that. So the question was, maybe this has just been focused in the wrong direction. And I think that Peter Cook's work on getting robotics into sub-Saharan Africa, I think that pointed out really well. It wasn't the marketing. It was actually the peer instruction. I mean, the fact that you could actually do something that people could learn from meant that you had to have a lot of engagement with somebody who else knew. Having that engagement with one instructor versus 50,000 students isn't going to work. But if you have a TA versus 50 students, maybe it does work. If you have 80,000 people sign up for your MOOC, trying to get 100 TAs is going to be difficult.
And in your time zone, in the same time zone, and speaking your native language. So when you look at Coursera, the Stanford NLP courses now we've got subtitles in Turkish, in Turkish, Chinese, and Spanish.
I mean, but the other problem here is if you go with like Peter, the robotics one in Africa, the problem there was, well, the way they resolved it was to use a lot of peer evaluation. And so they had robotics projects, and you could tell whether or not you were succeeding, and you had other teams coming in critiquing what you're doing and guiding you. But in a lot of fields, there's a problem with the peer tutoring. My teaching fellowship at Stanford became something that's now called residential computing. It was very much about peer teaching in computer science. And the problem with it is that you've got to do your quality control. And once you start to fan out into large numbers, you lose track of that. So, we do see these effects where there's peer teaching where they're basically promulgating things that aren't quite right to teach. That's a problem. If you've got a very clear outcome like robotics, like go after grabbing a ball in the middle of a table, that's quantifiable, but not all subjects could be.
Yeah, sure, but presumably then, training the trainer and training the TA is a solvable problem, and the certifications and quizzes.
It seems like it's solvable, but Silicon Valley, I can think of firms that have A16Z money to the tune of $50 million that aren't finding this to be a solvable problem. A lot of human reasons why. But yeah, I think that MOOCs do help on the training the trainers. Some people argue that it's a false dilemma, that training the trainers isn't really a problem, but those tend to be the trainers who go after the early stage of the S-curve. People who are really trying to knock down a lot of the confusion that you have in the early stages, the slow start. When you get into more expertise areas, train the trainer doesn't work. Clearly. We have a thing, we followed the Ask Me Anything that Reddit popularized. We use that at conferences where we'll take up a project like Spark and we'll take the top committers, put them in a room, and have 50 people come in, and it's a free-for-all. Ask any question, it's fair game. A lot of people go just to hear what questions will be asked, but that's not for beginners. That's no training wheels involved. This is for people who have a pain point, and they found a bug that the committers didn't even know about. And that's very vital, but the train the trainers model falls apart there completely. So I think you have to, so my takeaway on that, I mentioned segmentation. I mentioned a lot of dimensions. You really do have to segment the market, so to speak, to be able to provide the right kind of instruction.
Yeah, sure. I think there's an enormous difference between, PhD level advanced robotics and, conversational Spanish. One of them is a complete no-brainer. It's fairly obvious how to upscale them, and one of them is very, very
Let me go to another question. Yes.
I thought about games as a medium for.
There's a lot of gamification. That's I would point to like Keith Devlin at Stanford does mathematics games, very popular. He's very well recognized in that. Also, one of my neighbors is fastball. And I definitely think that there's some great work in gamification. I've seen this even inside of like Salesforce. They have some interesting gamification on network security that they use with their developers. Yeah, it's interesting. Publishing leaderboards is one thing, but actually having badges and getting into games is weird.
The second one completely finished, not gamification of pieces of learning, but actually as a secondary objective in a game.
Oh, there are. And yeah, actually, I don't know how much I can say, but let's just say that there are people who are very interested in virtual reality and augmented reality who have a lot of very interesting ideas. And I won't necessarily say that Montessori is the best way to teach people, but I had my kids go through Montessori schools, and we really loved it. And there's a lot of notions there about how to manipulate your world that fit very well with virtual reality. So I think we're on the same thing, but I can't say much more about that. Someone, yes?
Can you've got a lot of MOOCs about geeky things by geeky people. How do you denormalize or fix your conclusions based on the different stripes of content? Even simple content.
Well, this is also where the editors come in. We spend a lot of time figuring out who would be good to do a thing, and then at what level are they appropriate. So there's a lot of topics in the range of open source computing, and there's a lot of people available. The question is, which ones are good to do the teaching, and at what level are they good to do the teaching? How can you really fit that? And the other hard problem is, how does it cross over? Some subjects have to cross between domains, and finding somebody who's good. Like, for instance, you'll get, Databricks can teach you Spark, and DataStax will teach you Cassandra. Who's going to teach you Spark on Cassandra? Because their boards of directors don't necessarily want them to do that. Maybe they do. I don't know. I don't want to pick on them. Does that kind of answer?
Yeah, I'm thinking of really non-technical subjects that where this kind of approach would make a lot of sense. Even just a chemistry or cooking or, you know.
Yeah, business, we do a lot of business titles these days, and we see more of that. And that's what I was doing, was actually advanced math for business people. So key stakeholders can understand, what is graph theory going to buy me? And what are some supply chain optimization things, use cases that actually make sense? So I'm more, these days I'm going after more of a business market than a technical market, personally. Thank you very much, I really appreciate it.
Hey, thank you.